Ronald Wilson Reagan, the son of John Reagan and Nellie Wilson, was born above the general store in Tampico, Illinois on February 6, 1911. While they lived there, his father, who held left-of-center political views and bravely spoke out against the activities of the Ku Klux Klan, became a partner in a shoe store. But during the Great Depression, his father was forced to close down his shoe store. He found a new job as a result of the New Deal. This resulted in both father and son becoming passionate supporters of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Democratic Party. In high school, Reagan developed a strong interest in sports, and in 1928 won an athletic scholarship which enabled him to gain a place at Eureka College. Reagan studied economics and sociology, but it was as a football player and a swimmer that he excelled. After leaving college, Reagan was able to find work as a sports announcer for the Davenport radio station WOC. In 1933, Reagan moved to the WHO radio station in Des Moines, and over the next 4 years became one of the most popular sports commenters in the region. In 1937, Reagan moved to California, and after a screen test with Warner Brothers, was given a 7-year contract. Reagan appeared in a series of indistinguished films including Hollywood Hotel and Love is in the Air in 1937, Accidents Will Happen, Boy Meets Girl, Brother Rat, Cowboy from Brooklyn, and Sergeant Murphy in 1938, Angels Wash Their Faces in 1939, and finally, An Angel from Texas and the Santa Fe Trial in 1940. When the United States entered the Second World War, Reagan joined the Army Air Corps and made training films for pilots. Discharged in December 1945 as a captain, he resumed his film career. Reagan was a member of the Screen Actors Guild, and in 1947 he was elected president of the organization. He had a reputation as a liberal, but this soon changed when the House of Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, chaired by J. Parnell Thomas, began an investigation into the Hollywood motion pictures industry. The HUAC interviewed 41 people who were working in Hollywood. These people attended voluntarily and became known as friendly witnesses. During their interviews, they named 19 people who they accused of holding left-wing views. Over the next few years, FBI agents working with the House of Un-American Activities Committee and the Hollywood Motion Pictures producers got 320 people blacklisted from the entertainment industry. Reagan's support of McCarthyism enabled him to continue working in Hollywood, but he only appeared in mediocre films. Between 1954 and 1962, Reagan also worked for General Electric as host of the company's weekly half-hour dramas for television. In the 1930s and 40s, Reagan had been a loyal supporter of the Democratic Party. However, he switched to the Republican Party after the war and supported Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. In 1964, Reagan became a national political figure. This was as a result of a televised speech in support of Barry Goldwater. It did not help Goldwater win the election since he was seen by most people in America as a dangerous right-wing extremist. However, it did convince members of the California business community that here was a man with the charm to sell right-wing extremism. Reagan was approached about becoming the Republican Party candidate as governor of California. With the help of a smear campaign against Pat Brown and promises of tax cuts, he won an easy victory. As governor, Reagan quickly established himself as one of the country's leading conservative political figures. This included dramatic budget cuts and a hiring freeze for state agencies. He also put up student fees, and when they complained, he sent state troopers to deal with their protest meetings. Re-elected with 52% of the vote in 1970, Reagan introduced a series of welfare reforms during his second term in office. This included tightening eligibility requirements for welfare aid and requiring the able to seek work, rather than receiving benefits. However, the tax cuts never came. In fact, he presided over the largest tax increase any state had ever demanded in American history. Reagan rejected 2 officers of cabinet posts from President Gerald Ford, and in 1975 announced that he intended to challenge him as the Republican Party presidential candidate. However, he was defeated by Ford in the contest for the nomination. An article published in Time magazine in 1980 claimed that Deaver was playing an important role in Reagan's campaign to be nominated as the Republican presidential candidate, whereas people like campaign director William J. Casey were outsiders and had valuable experience but exercised less influence over the candidate. Reagan's main problem was that he was now 68 and his opponents claimed he was too old for the job. He overcame this problem by campaigning aggressively, and despite his tendencies to make silly factual mistakes in interviews, he generally performed well. During his campaign, he promised a patriotic crusade to reduce the size and scope of government, to rebuild American military power and self-respect, and to restore traditional values. According to Barbara Honegger, a researcher and policy analyst with the 1980 Reagan-Bush campaign, William J. Casey and other representatives of the Reagan presidential campaign made a deal at 2 sets of meetings in July and August at the Ritz Hotel in Madrid with Iranians to delay the release of Americans held hostage in Iran until after the November 1980 presidential elections. Reagan's aides promised that they would get a better deal if they waited until Carter was defeated. During the campaign, Ronald Reagan was informed that Jimmy Carter was attempting to negotiate a deal with Iran to get the American hostages released. This was disastrous news for the Reagan campaign before the election. The CIA leaked information to Reagan and George H.W. Bush. This attempted deal was also passed to the media. On October 11th, the Washington Post reported rumors of a secret deal that would see the hostages released in exchange for the American-made military spare parts Iran needed to continue its fight against Iraq. Reagan had promised the Iranian government that he would arrange for them to get all the arms they needed in exchange for the hostages. In the election, Reagan easily defeated Jimmy Carter by 44 million votes to 35 million. The Republican Party also won control of the Senate for the first time in 26 years. According to Mansour Rafizadeh, the former U.S. station chief of SAVAK, the Iranian secret police, CIA agents had persuaded Khomeini not to release the American hostages until Reagan was sworn in. In fact, they were released 20 minutes after his inaugural address. Reagan appointed William J. Casey as director of the CIA. In this position, he was able to arrange the delivery of arms to Iran. These were delivered via Israel. By the end of 1982, all of Reagan's promises to Iran had been made. With the deal completed, Iran was free to resort to acts of terrorism against the U.S. After his election as president, Ronald Reagan appointed Michael Deaver as Deputy White House Chief of Staff under James Baker III. He took up his post January 1981. On March 19, 1981, Reagan asked Congress to lift the embargo on arms sales to Argentina. Aid and training were provided to the Contras through the Argentinian Defense Force in exchange for other forms of aid from the U.S. to Argentina. Reagan had more difficulty persuading Congress to provide arms to Guatemala. Reagan also helped Guatemala in other ways. The Ronald Reagan administration arranged for the training of more than 200 Guatemalan officers in interrogation techniques, torture, and repressive methods. Reagan took a firm stance against communism and described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Although he avoided direct conflict with major communist countries such as China, he did send paratroopers to defeat communist governments and funded death squads in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala in the 1980s to battle communism. Although there was a federal deficit of over $100 billion, Reagan managed to persuade Congress in 1981 to pass a plan for a 3-year reduction in income tax rates. This was followed by cuts in domestic spendings. During the 1980s, Reagan's policies of reducing income taxes and federal domestic budgets became known as Reaganomics. These tax changes and the cuts in the welfare system widened the gap between rich and poor. It also caused deep recession. In 1981, Reagan sent Donald Rumsfeld, his Middle East envoy, to Iraq. This resulted in Reagan selling Saddam Hussein dual-use items, including helicopters and chemicals. He also armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that eventually evolved into the Taliban. In the 1984 presidential election, Reagan remained popular with the electorate and easily defeated Mondale by winning 525 of the 538 electoral votes. In late 1986, Reagan became embroiled in what became known as the Iran-Gate scandal. It was discovered that the Reagan administration had been selling arms to the Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran in order to gain the release of American hostages in Lebanon. The scandal was damaging to Reagan because he had told the American public he would never yield to terrorism blackmail. As a result of the scandal, the White House Chief of Staff, Ronald Reagan, and his National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, were forced to resign. Reagan survived, but the case damaged his image and gave the impression that he was not in full control of his administration. In 1987, Reagan met Mikhail Gorbachev and signed the Immediate Nuclear Forces Abolition Treaty, INF. Reagan retired from office at the end of his second term in 1989. He spent his time establishing the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, but in 1994, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Ronald Reagan, age 93, died of pneumonia at his house in Bel Air district of Los Angeles on June 5, 2004.